The prairie wind carried with it the smell of dust and mesquite, rolling over the wide, empty land like a restless spirit. In that land where the sun burned without mercy and the nights wrapped themselves in cold silence, stories were born that few ever dared to repeat. It was a place where men fought for cattle, land, and pride, and where women endured the weight of loyalty, love, and fear. Among the endless horizons, a tale began to unfold that would test the boundaries of honor and the fragile threads of the human heart. The settlement was still young, built on soil wrestled from the wild. Wooden cabins leaned against one another, as if drawing strength, and the sound of horses echoed through the dry air. Men with rifles on their shoulders stood guard at the edges of the town, wary of raiders and shadows alike. Everyone knew the land did not belong to them alone. It carried the footsteps of the Apache, who had lived and bled there long before any fences or roads scarred the earth. Among those settlers lived a woman whose quiet strength was hidden behind her calm eyes and careful smile. She was the wife of a rancher, a man hardened by the land, driven by the need to survive in a world that demanded more than most could give. To the townsfolk, she was steady and faithful, the kind of woman who carried her burdens without complaint. Yet her heart, like the land itself, held secrets no one could see. The rancher had an enemy, one who came not from the neighboring towns, but from the Apache. The warrior was known for his fierce spirit, a figure both feared and respected, moving through the land as if it bowed to his steps. To some, he was the enemy of progress, the storm that threatened the fragile hold the settlers had claimed. To others, he was a reminder that no matter how many cabins were built or how many cattle grazed, the land still had an old master. The first time she saw him was not in battle or chaos, but in silence. He stood at the edge of the trees, the fading light setting fire to his long black hair, his posture steady like the earth itself. She had felt something stir inside her then, a feeling she could not name. It was not fear, though her heart beat faster, and it was not hatred, though she had been told to see him as an enemy. It was something dangerous, something that pulled her eyes back to him, even when she tried to look away. For months, she buried that moment beneath her duties. She tended the fire, sewed by lantern light, and waited for her husband's heavy steps on the porch. But the world outside was changing. Raids struck cattle herds, gunfire echoed in the distance, and whispers of Apache movements filled the town. Her husband rode out often, his rifle always close, his anger sharp as the edge of a knife. And each time he spoke of his rival, the warrior whose presence haunted his pride, she listened in silence, though her heart ached in ways she could not admit. One evening, when the air was thick with the smoke of burning mesquite, she found herself standing by the corral, staring at the horizon. Her husband was away, chasing another rumor of Apache riders, leaving her with the quiet of the night. And it was then she saw him again. The warrior emerged from the shadows of the trees, his steps silent, his presence commanding. She should have called for help, should have run inside and bolted the door. Instead, she stood rooted to the ground, her breath caught between fear and something far deeper. His eyes met hers across the distance. They were dark, steady, and filled with a strength that seemed to pierce through her carefully built walls. He did not move closer, nor did he raise a weapon. He only watched, and in that silence, she felt more seen than she ever had in her life. When he finally turned and melted back into the woods, she felt the world shift beneath her feet. From that night on, she could not forget. The image of him lingered in her thoughts, intruding as she poured water, as she stitched. As she sat beside her husband at the long wooden table, she hated herself for it, yet she could not chase it away. The more her husband raged about the Apache warrior, the deeper the conflict carved into her soul. The days bled into nights, and with each passing moment, the tension in the settlement grew. Shots rang out at the edges of the land. Horses came back wounded and men came back bleeding. The rancher's hatred deepened, his rivalry with the warrior becoming a storm that threatened to break the fragile balance of their lives. And in the heart of that storm stood the woman, torn between loyalty to the man she had married and the undeniable pull toward the one she was told to despise. She did not know how it would end, nor could she have imagined the words that would one day escape her lips. It happened beneath a sky heavy with stars, the night air sharp and alive with the sound of crickets. The warrior stood before her, closer now than ever, the firelight catching on the beads of his tribal jewelry. She felt her heart pounding, her breath trembling as though the land itself held its breath with her. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of the truth she had carried too long. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft yet steady, cutting through the night like the crack of a rifle. "I want to be yours," she told him, her words trembling with both defiance and surrender. The world seemed to stop in that moment. The flames flickered, the stars blinked, and the silence stretched so heavy it nearly broke her. She knew what she had said could not be taken back. She knew the danger it carried, the betrayal it meant, the storm it would unleash, and yet she could not call the words back to her lips. The warrior did not answer right away. His eyes searched hers, deep and unreadable, as if weighing the weight of her soul. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl cried, and the wind stirred the branches. The night held its secrets close, refusing to reveal what would come next. And so, the tale paused on the edge of that moment, caught between love and ruin, loyalty and longing. A story waiting to unfold in the silence of the prairie. The words she had spoken still hung in the air, fragile and dangerous, as if the night itself had paused to listen. The warrior's silence felt heavier than any spoken answer, and she wondered if she had gone too far. If her confession was a flame that might burn everything she had ever known. His face was unreadable in the flicker of firelight, his shadow stretching long across the ground, and yet his presence was steady, like the mountains that watched over the plains. She waited, her heart pounding so loudly she feared he could hear it, but no reply came. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the horizon, as though the stars themselves carried a message only he could read. That silence haunted her even after he slipped back into the darkness, leaving her alone by the fire. She stood there for a long time, her hands trembling, her breath uneven, until the sound of the night wrapped back around her. She had spoken a truth she had buried for too long, a truth that would change everything if ever it came to light, and yet she did not regret it. Oh, the words had been born from something she could no longer deny, something that had taken root in her heart long before she could name it. The next morning, she went about her chores as if nothing had happened. She poured water, fed the chickens, and swept the dirt from the porch, her body moving with practiced ease while her mind drifted elsewhere. Every creak of the wooden boards, every gust of wind across the fields, reminded her of the night before. When her husband returned that afternoon, his boots heavy with dust and his temper sharp from another fruitless chase after Apache riders, she sat across from him at the table, her face calm. She nodded at his words, answered when he asked, and listened to his anger spill out like boiling water. But inside, her thoughts were far away, caught between the man she had married and the warrior who had heard her secret. The rancher had long carried a hatred for that rival. His stories of lost cattle, ambushed riders, and burned fences always returned to the same name, the same man. He would pound his fist against the table and swear that one day he would bring his enemy down, that the land would be safe only when the warrior was gone. She listened, her stomach tightening with every word, knowing that her husband's hatred was growing stronger with each passing day. The settlers whispered too, round fires in the dim lantern glow of the saloon. Their talk circled back to the Apache warrior. Some feared him as if he were a shadow waiting beyond the edge of the trees. Others respected him, speaking in low tones of his skill, his courage, his defiance in the face of a growing tide of settlers who claimed land that was not theirs. The stories painted him as both enemy and protector, a man who fought not out of cruelty, but out of loyalty to his people and the soil beneath his feet. She wondered often what it meant to belong so fully to the land, to carry a purpose greater than oneself. Her life had been bound to duty, to survival, to the expectations placed upon her. She had never been asked what her heart wanted, never allowed to follow the call of her own soul. And yet now, with the memory of his eyes and the echo of her own words, she felt a stirring that frightened her as much as it gave her strength. Days stretched into weeks, each one filled with the tension of waiting. The rivalry between her husband and the warrior grew sharper, their paths crossing not in meetings but in signs of one another's presence. A wounded horse limping back to the ranch, an arrow found lodged in a fence post, a trail of hoofprints disappearing into the hills. Her husband grew restless, his anger spilling into every corner of the house, while she grew quieter, guarding her secret like a flame sheltered against the wind. At night, she often stood by the window, staring out at the wide plains. Sometimes she thought she saw movement in the distance, a shadow near the tree line, a figure watching. She never spoke of it, never told her husband what she felt in those moments, for she knew it would bring nothing but bloodshed. Still, her heart leapt at the thought that he might be near, that perhaps he remembered her words and carried them with him. Her thoughts often returned to the first time she had seen the warrior, that day when he stood at the edge of the trees, silent and unyielding. She remembered the way the light had touched his face, the way his presence had filled the space between them without a single word spoken. It was not something she had asked for, nor something she could have planned, but it had taken hold of her just the same. She thought of what it meant for her to feel such a pull toward the man her husband despised, and she wondered if she was cursed or blessed by it. The town itself seemed to sense the growing storm. The preachers spoke louder on Sundays, warning of sin, of temptation, of enemies that would test their resolve. Mothers pulled their children close, fathers sharpened their knives, and the men who rode with her husband watched the horizon with hungry eyes. Everyone knew that a reckoning was coming, though none could say when or how. One afternoon, while she was hanging laundry in the sun, she heard the distant sound of hooves. She looked up, squinting into the light, and saw riders moving fast across the fields. Her husband was among them, his rifle slung across his back, his jaw tight with determination. They rode hard, disappearing into the hills, chasing another sign of Apache movement. She stood there with the sheets fluttering around her, her hands gripping the cloth as if it could anchor her to the earth. She did not know if he would return whole, or if his anger would finally drive him into the path of the man who had claimed her thoughts. That evening, when the sun bled red across the sky, she found herself once more drawn to the edge of the trees. She told herself she only wanted to walk, to breathe the cool air, but deep inside she knew what she was hoping for. And there, as the light faded, she saw him again. He stood not far away, his figure tall and still, his eyes fixed on her with the same steady weight as before. Her breath caught, and though her heart begged her to step closer, her feet stayed rooted in place. The memory of her words rose in her chest, reminding her of the dangerous truth she had already revealed, yet she could not look away. For a moment, the world fell silent around them, the distance between them charged with all that had been left unspoken. But then the sound of gunfire cracked through the air, sharp and sudden. Echoing from the hills where her husband had ridden, the warrior's gaze flickered toward the sound, his posture tensing, and she felt the blood drain from her face. Something was happening, something that would shatter the fragile balance that had held until now. Before she could move, he turned and vanished into the darkness of the trees, swift and silent as a shadow. She stood there alone, the echo of the shots still ringing in her ears, her body trembling with the knowledge that the storm was no longer distant. It was here, and it was coming for all of them. And with the night pressing in around her, she knew her heart was bound to a choice that could not be undone. The sound of those gunshots did not fade easily from her mind. All night she sat by the window, lantern light casting a dim glow across the wooden floor, waiting for a sign. The prairie beyond the fence was swallowed in darkness, the cries of coyotes drifting on the wind, yet her eyes never left the horizon. Each passing hour grew heavier, each creak of the house more unsettling. She thought of her husband, riding with his men into the hills, chasing shadows of Apache riders. She thought of the warrior, disappearing into the trees, his figure swallowed by silence. Somewhere out there, the clash of pride and vengeance had begun to unfold, and she could do nothing but wait for its echo to reach her door. When the riders finally returned, it was well past midnight. Hooves thundered across the hard earth, and voices rose in sharp tones. She hurried outside, the cold biting against her skin. Her husband dismounted, his face streaked with dust, his hands trembling as he gripped the rifle still in his grasp. One man had been wounded, slumped over in the saddle, while the others wore the look of men who had come too close to death. Her husband barked orders, his voice thick with frustration, his jaw clenched so tightly she thought it might break. The men spoke of ambush, of arrows hissing through the night, of shadows that struck and vanished before a shot could be fired. Her husband swore that the Apache warrior was there, leading his men, taunting him with every move. He spat into the dirt and vowed that he would not rest until the rival's blood stained the ground. She stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped tight around herself, listening to his rage. The fire in his eyes was not only hatred, but something deeper, a pride wounded so sharply it could not heal. She knew then that this rivalry was no longer about cattle or fences. It had become personal, a matter of man against man, a storm of honor that would not end without ruin. As the men carried the wounded inside, she noticed her husband's hand shaking as he poured water into a basin. He hid it quickly, slamming the cup down on the table, but she had seen it. For all his anger, there was fear in him too, though he would never name it. That fear was not only of death, but of being bested, of losing to the man who haunted his every thought. She tended to the wounded man, pressing cloth against the bleeding shoulder, while her husband paced the room like a caged animal. The silence between them grew heavier than words, each of them lost in a storm the other could not reach. The days that followed carried an uneasy rhythm. Men from the town sharpened their rifles, fixing saddles, speaking of another ride out. The preacher prayed louder, warning of enemies at the gate, urging the settlers to hold fast to their faith. Mothers kept their children inside, and the streets emptied earlier each night. Yet beneath the fear was something else, a whisper of doubt that none dared speak aloud. Was the Apache warrior truly the enemy they claimed him to be, or was he only defending the land that had always been his? The settlers had carved their homes into the soil, but the soil itself carried older stories, older loyalties. Some admitted this quietly, while others silenced the thought before it could grow. She felt it most deeply in the quiet moments. When she walked the fields alone, she could almost sense the presence of eyes watching from the hills. When she fetched water, she felt the pull of the trees at the edge of the land, as though they were calling her name. Each night she dreamed of the warrior, his gaze steady, his silence louder than any words. She woke with her heart pounding, torn between fear and longing. Her husband's hatred grew sharper each day, and she knew that if he ever learned of what she had said, of what she felt, the storm between the two men would tear more than just the land apart. The conflict did not only stir inside her home. Others in the settlement carried their own secrets and struggles. One of the younger ranch hands, quiet and thoughtful, confided to her in hushed tones that he had once crossed paths with the warrior alone. He said the man had spared him, let him go when he could have easily taken his life. His voice shook as he told her this, as if admitting something forbidden. It planted a seed of doubt in her that grew larger each day. What kind of enemy showed mercy? What kind of man held back when vengeance could have been his? Her husband, meanwhile, grew restless with the whispers. He accused his men of cowardice, cursed the land for defying him, and drank more heavily as the night stretched on. He spoke often of setting a trap, of forcing his rival into a corner from which he could not escape. His pride demanded victory, but his obsession cast a shadow over the ranch, and she felt the walls closing in around her. One evening she found herself drawn again to the edge of the trees. She told herself it was foolish, dangerous, but her feet carried her forward anyway. The air was heavy with the scent of pine. The grass cooled beneath her shoes. She waited, her heart pounding, until she saw him step from the shadows. He did not speak, nor did she. They stood facing one another, the silence filled with all that had been left unspoken. Her chest tightened, and she wanted to ask why he lingered, why he risked so much by coming near. But no words would form. The warrior studied her, his gaze steady, as though weighing something within her. At last he raised his hand, pointing toward the hills where her husband often rode. His meaning was clear. Danger was building there, danger greater than even her husband's rage could imagine. She nodded, though her throat was tight, and before she could say more, he turned and disappeared into the night. She returned home with her heart in turmoil. She wanted to tell her husband what she had seen, to warn him that the path he chased was leading to ruin. Yet she knew he would not hear it. His pride would not allow him to believe that the man he hated might hold the upper hand, might even show her something she could not turn away from. So she held the secret close, another stone added to the weight she carried. The settlement grew tenser with each passing day. Small skirmishes flared along the edges of the land, cattle driven off in the night, fences torn down. Men returned with wounds, arrows found lodged in wagon wheels. Each sign only deepened the rancher's fury, while the warrior's name spread like fire through the town. To the settlers he became a legend, both feared and respected, a figure that loomed larger with every story. To her, he remained something else entirely, a man tied not only to the land, but now to her own heart. One night, as the wind howled against the walls, she overheard her husband speaking with the men. They planned to set an ambush, to draw the Apache warrior into a trap near the river, where the rocks narrowed and the water slowed. Her husband's voice was sharp with hunger, his men nodding in grim agreement. She pressed her hand against the wall, listening, her breath shallow. If they succeeded, it would end in blood. If they failed, it would end in ruin. Either way, the land would not be the same again. She lay awake long after the voices had faded, staring at the ceiling. Her heart pulled in two directions, loyalty to her husband on one side, the memory of the warrior's gaze on the other. She thought of the words she had spoken, the ones that could not be taken back, and she knew the storm was nearly here. The prairie outside lay silent, but in that silence she felt the tension mounting, the threads of fate pulling tighter. Somewhere in the darkness, two men prepared to face one another, bound not only by rivalry, but by her own hidden truth. And she knew, with every beat of her heart, that when the clash came, there would be no turning back. The days that followed felt like the tightening of a noose. Every breath of wind carried unease. Every creak of the house felt like a warning. The rancher grew consumed by the thought of the ambush, his words sharper, his temper shorter. He walked the rooms with the restless energy of a man who could not sit still, always cleaning his rifle, always checking his saddle, as though the weight of waiting would tear him apart. His wife watched quietly, keeping her hands busy with the small duties of the home, but inside her chest her heart beat with the same restless rhythm. She knew something was coming, something that would change their lives forever. The settlement shared that feeling. Men gathered in clusters, speaking low and urgent, while women lingered near doorways with worried eyes. The preacher's sermons became more desperate, his words thundering against sin, pride, and the dangers of the wilderness. Children played less in the open fields, their laughter replaced with hushed whispers, as if even they could sense that the land was holding its breath. Rumors spread quickly, carrying stories of raids further west, of settlers who had vanished without a trace, of warriors who struck with the precision of ghosts. And always, at the heart of those whispers, was the Apache leader, the man who had become both legend and shadow. At night, when the rancher paced and plotted, she sat by the window, her gaze drawn to the horizon. She thought of the warrior more often than she dared admit, his steady eyes, his silence, his presence that lingered long after he was gone. She remembered the warning he had given her, the gesture toward the hills where danger grew thicker each day. It haunted her, the thought that he might be watching even now, not as an enemy, but as something else entirely. And it tore at her heart that the man she was bound to despise was the same man whose strength and stillness she could not forget. The night before the ambush, the rancher gathered his men at the edge of the barn. She listened from the shadows, unseen, her hands pressed to her chest. They spoke of the river bend, of how they would draw the warrior out, corner him between the rocks where he would have no place to run. Her husband's voice was sharp and certain, heavy with the promise of vengeance. His men nodded, some with determination, others with doubt they dared not speak aloud. When the meeting ended, the rancher lifted his rifle, as though it were already heavy with victory. She slipped back inside before he could see her, her thoughts a storm of fear and longing. She lay awake long into the night, staring into the darkness. The words she had once spoken returned to her, words that had bound her heart to a secret she could never reveal. She wanted to run, to warn the warrior of what was waiting, but the weight of loyalty held her down. If she betrayed her husband, she would destroy the life she had built. If she stayed silent, she might be condemning a man who had already claimed part of her soul. The choice pressed on her until sleep finally stole her into dreams that felt more real than the waking world. When morning came, the ranch was alive with motion. Saddles tightened, rifles checked. Horses restless beneath the weight of men who carried more than weapons, they carried pride, anger, and fear. The rancher moved with the determination of a man marching toward destiny, his jaw tight, his eyes unyielding. She watched from the porch, her hands clenched against her skirt as he swung into the saddle. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no softness there, only the fire of a man who had sworn to finish what he had begun. Then he turned, spurred his horse, and rode off with his men trailing behind, dust rising in a heavy cloud that soon swallowed them from sight. The silence that followed was unbearable. She moved through the house, her hands restless, her thoughts louder than the creak of the boards beneath her feet. Every sound from outside made her start, every gust of wind made her heart leap. She tried to busy herself with chores, but the weight of waiting pressed against her like a storm rolling over the plains. Her mind drifted to the warrior, wondering if he already knew of the trap, wondering if he would ride into it, strong and fearless, or if fate would turn the ambush into something none of them could control. Hours passed, slow and heavy. The sun climbed high, casting its merciless light across the land. She fetched water, her hands trembling as she carried the bucket back to the porch. Each step felt heavier than the last. She paused, looking toward the hills in the distance, and thought she saw movement shadows slipping between trees, too far to name, but close enough to stir the fear in her chest. She clutched the bucket tighter, her breath catching, until the vision faded into the heat haze. As the day stretched on, she found herself walking the edge of the fields, drawn toward the trees, though she knew it was dangerous. The land felt different now, charged with an energy that made the hairs on her arms rise. Birds scattered suddenly from branches, their cries sharp and frantic. Ah! The silence that followed was deeper than before, as if the earth itself was listening. Ah! And then, just beyond the shade of the trees, she saw him. The warrior stood still, his presence as steady as she remembered, his eyes fixed on her. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The distance between them felt smaller this time, the air thick with everything unspoken. He did not step closer, yet the weight of his gaze reached her, pulling her into a silence that spoke more than words ever could. She wanted to warn him, to beg him not to ride into the trap that had been laid, but her voice refused to rise. Her heart ached with the words she could not speak, the choice she could not make. He tilted his head slightly as if he could read her thoughts. His hand brushed against the hilt of the weapon at his side, but he did not raise it. For a moment the world felt suspended, the air heavy with all that could not be said, and then without a word he turned and vanished into the shadows. Leaving her standing alone, her body trembling with the weight of what was to come. The afternoon passed into evening, and the sky bled red with the setting sun. The ranch lay in uneasy silence, every creak of wood and rustle of wind louder than it should have been. She sat on the porch, her hands clenched in her lap, staring at the horizon. The dust from her husband's ride had long settled, but still there was no sign of his return. Her chest tightened with each passing moment, torn between dread for his safety and fear for the man she could not forget. As the first stars began to pierce the sky, the sound came. Faint at first, then growing clearer, the distant crack of gunfire rolling across the plains. Her heart leapt into her throat. The shots came in bursts, echoing against the hills, sharp and relentless. She stood, gripping the porch rail, her breath shallow as the sound carried through the night. Somewhere out there, steel and lead clashed against bow and spirit. Somewhere out there, her husband and the warrior were stepping into the fate that had been circling them both for so long. The gunfire stretched on, scattered with shouts too faint to name, until at last the night fell back into silence. She stood frozen, her body trembling, waiting for some sign of what had happened. The prairie lay dark and quiet once more, the stars cold above her, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was the silence of something unfinished, of a storm that had only begun to break. And as she stood there alone beneath the weight of the night, she knew the moment she had feared most was drawing closer. The clash between her husband and the warrior was no longer a distant threat. It was here, it was real, and it was only a matter of time before it reached her doorstep. The silence after the gunfire stretched on until it felt unbearable. She stood at the porch rail, her knuckles white, her breath shallow, waiting for any sign. The stars burned cold above, and the land itself seemed to hold its breath, as though it knew the weight of what had just taken place. Every second that passed pressed down heavier on her chest. She did not know. If her husband still lived, if the warrior had survived, or if both men had fallen beneath the dark hills. The not knowing was worse than any answer. At last, she saw movement in the distance. Horses stumbled back through the night, their riders' weary shadows barely clinging to the saddles. She rushed forward, her skirts brushing against the dirt, her heart pounding so fiercely it hurt. When the men reached the yard, she counted them quickly, her eyes darting from face to face. Some were wounded, some silent with shock, but not all who had left had returned. Her husband slid from his saddle, his rifle hanging useless at his side. Blood streaked his sleeve and his eyes were clouded, not with defeat, but with something far heavier. He stumbled toward the porch, and she rushed to meet him, her hands steady as she guided him inside. His men followed, some carrying the injured, others silent as they lowered themselves onto chairs in the floor. The house filled with the smell of sweat, dust, and blood, the air heavy with unspoken truth. She cleaned her husband's arm, her hands careful but firm, listening as fragments of the story spilled out. The ambush had not gone as planned. The warrior and his men had known they were waiting, turning the trap into a battlefield that left both sides scarred. Horses fell, men cried out, and the riverbank had echoed with the clash of gunfire and arrows. Her husband spoke of the warrior, his voice raw, filled not with triumph, but with something close to awe. He had fought fiercely, unbroken, a figure in the night who seemed to carry the land itself within him. And though the rancher had sworn vengeance, he could not say the man had been defeated. The battle ended not with death but with retreat, both sides pulling back into the shadows, leaving the outcome unfinished. She listened, her heart aching with relief and dread. Relief that both men still lived, dread that this meant the storm had only been delayed. Her husband's pride was wounded, his body marked, but his spirit had not surrendered. He vowed aloud that it was not over, that one day soon he would face his rival again. The other men nodded, though their eyes betrayed doubt, the kind of doubt born from seeing too much. In the days that followed, the settlement tried to mend. The wounded were tended, the fences rebuilt, the cattle gathered once more. Outwardly life went on, but the tension lingered like smoke after a fire. Men spoke less boldly now, their laughter thinner, their eyes often drifting toward the horizon, as if expecting shadows to rise again. The preacher called it a test of faith, but even he seemed quieter, as though his voice could not chase away what they had seen. She moved through her days with calm hands and a heavy heart. Her husband's anger simmered beneath the surface, flaring when he spoke of the warrior, quieting only when exhaustion overtook him. Yet in the quiet moments, when she was alone by the fire or standing at the window, her thoughts returned again and again to the man in the shadows. She thought of his steady gaze, the mercy he had shown others, the warning he had given her. She wondered what he thought of her now, if he carried her words with him as she carried his silence. One evening, when the sky glowed gold with the setting sun, she walked again to the edge of the fields. The trees stood dark and patient, the air cool against her skin. She did not know why she went, only that her heart led her there, and as before he was waiting. The warrior stepped from the shadows, his presence calm, his eyes fixed on her with the same steady weight. For a long moment they simply looked at one another, the silence between them deeper than words. Her throat tightened, but she found her voice. She told him of the ambush, of the blood spilled, of her fear that more would come. She told him she did not want death to claim either side, though she knew she had little power to stop it. And she told him again what her heart had whispered before, though her voice shook as she spoke it. She wanted to be his, though the world itself seemed to forbid it. He listened without interruption, his gaze never wavering. When she finished, he stepped closer, though not so near that they could touch. He spoke then, his voice low, carrying the weight of his people, his land, his honor. He said he could not take what was not freely hers to give. He said her path was bound to choices only she could make, choices that carried more than love but the lives,